Welcome to the Anomalous Review, the official podcast of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, or SCU. We're an organization working to promote the serious scientific study and discussion of anomalous phenomena. My name is Michael Glosson. I'm a philosopher of science and technology, a contributing member of SCU, and the host of the show. We're glad to have you listening, and we'd love for you to check us out at explorescu.org. One of the things that I, as a philosopher, find most fascinating about the UAP subject is that there are just so many different but interrelated dimensions to it. One can study UAP in so many ways, from so many different angles. Just considering the guests I've had on this show, there are people like Brandon Wheeler, who's a historian at the U.S. Naval Academy, and who studies UAP experiences through the lens of religious history. Or there are people like physicist Kevin Knuth at the University of New York, who studies UAP as physical and technological phenomena. Or people like neuroscientist Julia Mossbridge, who studies UAP through various theories of how the mind works. And to add to these, I personally know sociologists, anthropologists, philosophers, biologists, geologists, statisticians, psychologists, material scientists, literary theorists, and many other specialists who are studying these phenomena through their own disciplinary lenses. The number of angles seems endless, and they're all equally valid and fertile areas for interesting, productive research. That's one reason why we at SCU started this show, to showcase the amazing variety of interesting work that's being done on the subject. But this isn't the only reason we wanted to make this show. Another reason has to do with the fact that if you just don't happen to personally know a bunch of academics working on the UAP subject, you could be forgiven for thinking that the only people who have any real interest in it are people in the military and national security sectors. That's because a simple search of the news headlines, for instance, will turn up quite a lot of stories that consider the national security implications of UAP and not much else. You might find a few articles about pieces of legislation that mention UAP or that mention the language of non-human intelligence, or that mention UAP-related whistleblowers. But even those stories will in the end justify the interest in the UAP subject purely in terms of its significance for keeping the public, and usually here it's the American public, safe from possible threats. You'll have to dig pretty far into the search results to find any coverage that treats the UAP subject as historically, or philosophically, or religiously, or even scientifically interesting in its own right. But as we've seen on the show, it's not because there aren't serious scholars of history or philosophy or religion or science working on UAP. Why then is such a multidimensional subject so consistently portrayed as if it's really just a national security issue and nothing more? This is a question I ask myself and others in this field pretty often. I think the answer to it is really complex, and it would take a lot more than one discussion to lay out that answer responsibly. The first step in answering this question, though, is to acknowledge the fact that the UAP subject has, at least for the present moment, been rhetorically captured by a framework of national security concepts and interests. And this isn't necessarily, or even probably, the result of any nefarious intentions. I think it's just a natural result of the way American culture, and so global culture, tends to automatically frame and evaluate nearly everything in reference to America's position of global dominance in the world, and to the technologies of war, and the national security organizations that help maintain that position of global dominance. This fact lays the groundwork for some of the questions at the heart of my conversation today. Questions like, what is the relationship between the UAP subject and the spheres of government, national security, intelligence, and the military? What's the history of that relationship? When were UAP first considered a national security issue? And how has that national security framework evolved over time? And how can understanding all of this help us to understand the present situation? where public discussion of UAP is dominated by stories of crash retrieval programs or congressional whistleblowers or drone incursions over military space or legislation that references non-human intelligence. I can't think of a better guest to ask all of these questions to than my guest today, Larry Hancock. Larry is a board member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, which produces and hosts this program. He did his formal training in history and cultural anthropology before spending a career first in the United States Air Force and then as a strategic analyst and consultant. After his retirement from that career, he returned to his lifelong scholarly interests and to his nature as a document geek. That led him to author several books on the subjects of Cold War history, international relations, and national security, as well as to editing several collections of CIA, FBI, and military documents that had never before been published. Larry's most recent works include the books Shadow Warfare, which is on the history of covert action, and Deniable Warfare. The book Surprise Attack, which is about strategic command and control practices, and the book Unidentified, which is about the central subject of our conversation today, the national security and strategic intelligence problems posed by unidentified anomalous phenomena. I love talking to Larry. He is one of the most delightfully interesting people that I know, and I think you're really going to love this conversation. So, here now is my discussion with Larry Hancock. You've written a lot of books that are relevant in different sort of tangential ways to this, and this is a pretty sprawling subject. But I did want to start out the conversation by first asking, am I right to say that we're talking about national security and intelligence, but we're not really talking about it from a national security intelligence perspective. We're talking about it from a historical perspective. So we're like two lenses out. I want to understand how national security intelligence people think about the UAP subject, but I also want to understand how that way of thinking developed over time and like grew in different ways. So we've talked to Josh Pearson before, and he's like in that world. He embodies that way of thinking, but you have like a step removed from it. You've seen it, not just its current iteration, but lots of iterations of it. So maybe you can help us be aware of how not only what the current way of thinking is, but how it started and where it grew. So first of all, how do national security and intelligence, how does that world first come into contact with the UAP UFO subject? Is it Roswell or Kenneth Arnold or earlier or what?
No, the intelligence world, the security world, actually came into what you would call uh, analysis, recognition, uh, research of unknown flying objects during World War II. And if you think about it, the whole point, the security world deals with things that might be threats.
Mm-hmm.
So from that perception, prior to that time, during World War I or there were no aircraft. There was nothing that was really anomalous to the extent of being considered to be a threat, certainly. But during World War II, as that fight involved, interestingly enough, the transition may have been very gradual in terms of during the war, the intelligence community, for the first time, encountered aircraft whose performance was different. It was in advanced performance. I think probably one of the first was actually the Japanese Zero. When the U.S. encountered the Japanese Zero, it was quite surprising. It was a high speed, very maneuverable aircraft.
Is that
And
a
it
fighter
was
plane?
a fighter plane, yes, performing unfortunately very well against American aircraft, and it had kind of raised the standard for fighter aircraft, and it was a leap at that point in time. So the intelligence community was kind of shocked when you encounter something that's beyond your performance boundaries. Okay, yeah, known aircraft are a threat, but suddenly when one can outperform you, it becomes an area of study. So there was a big push to collect information about their performance, debrief pilots. What are the, let's profile their capabilities so we can compare them to ours. There was a big push to recover crashed aircraft so that the aircraft could be not so much reverse engineered, but compared. Okay,
Hmm.
what are they doing differently than what we're doing? And during the war, that kind of field intelligence work became very important to, you know, pilots would report, observers report a type of aircraft, a type of missile, something that was unknown. And they began to develop techniques to quickly collect data, set up teams, collect data, assemble that data, recover if possible. One of the fascinating things about during World War II, it's we can now document that they actually did this so effectively in Europe in particular that they were writing intelligence profiles of new German weapons and circulating it within the military organization in pretty much real time.
Hmm.
Very effective. It's kind of like if you see something like this, it may match X, and if so, it has these capabilities, and here's how you could try to deal with it. You
So
know,
it wasn't as we imagine, like I have this image in my head of like the occasional World War II pilot coming back and like sitting in the bar with somebody and saying, "Oh, I saw this really weird thing," and then kind of like hush talking about it in hushed terms or something. But you're saying that this was like an intentional network of information collection that was already going on kind of from the start or from the start of like the Japanese Zero. What was it that made the Japanese Zero different or better, just out of curiosity?
um, engine power, wing configuration. It was very light. Uh, American aircraft have been built to be relatively robust and longer range. They were built for a different type of dogfighting. Very light, very maneuverable, very high turn angles because they're lighter.
Mhm.
Okay. Uh, Another factor that made some Japanese aircraft more maneuverable is they didn't armor protect their fuel tanks,
Mm.
which made the aircraft much lighter. We could either use armor or rubberized self-sealing fuel tanks. They didn't use that technology, but so once we found out that they weren't using that
Shoot
technology,
the
as
thing.
guys shoot there,
Oh, so this
so
also gives us strategic, you know, advantages. Like we know how to take them out or you know,
yeah.
outmaneuver
And
them,
and
whatever.
that's where debriefings, you run into this a lot in the UFO discussion, but it became standard practice after a mission to debrief your pilots, particularly on long range missions when they're up in the bomber missions over Europe, for example, where they're in there for hours and hours. What was it like? What did you see? Did you encounter any unusual flak or anti-aircraft fire? Did you see anything? Because we were also wrestling with different types of anti-aircraft weapons.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole point was to get a good debrief of did you see anything different and give me a profile of it. And you know, pilots did not necessarily love that because they're just coming back from the mission, but it's like, okay, before you get to go eat, we're going to do a debrief. That's just standard practice. So I think that's where what you were talking about. No pilot, yeah, did pilots talk about things in the bar eventually? But no, it was a much more formalized practice of intelligence groups and field offices collecting this stuff, sending to headquarters putting it together not only to do assessments of possible new weapons, possible new aircraft, but to actually start writing newsletters and circulating them within the community, kind of saying, this has been reported. If you see it, we want more information. And by the way, and all that boiled down to, we now know that effectively, and I think this is something that's rather striking in regard to UFOs, UAPs, is that during the course of the war, American pilots in Europe described every new German weapon, whether it was a jet fighter, a ballistic missile, uh, whatever, a certain type of anti-aircraft flak. They described it and it came into the system before we knew what it was. You had very accurate descriptions of ballistic missiles headed towards England before we knew what they were. Uh,
This is
and
kind
it
of
was,
like a field experiment to test pilots'
yeah,
abilities to accurately describe strange objects in the sky. And you're saying that we can look back and see that they did a really good
yeah.
job?
It's fascinating because during the late 40s and early 50s, when the UFO phenomena really surged, two things would happen. One, for example, there was a proposal within the Air Force that should do an extensive study to determine whether pilots can effectively characterize unidentified objects. It's like, no, you know they can. You've known that for years now. And you also had very senior Air Force officers saying, oh, the pilots were just misidentifying things and they don't know what they were seeing. And it was a glare in the. Uh, no, no. And by the way, do you think about what you just said? These are combat pilots flying air defense missions, and your faith in them is so little that you don't think that they can characterize an anomalous object. In that case, what are they doing up there?
Sure.
It's like, but no, we knew that during World War II with the record of these observations during World War II. So it's all, I don't call it humorous, but it's kind of frustrating that that body of information is already there. We know trained pilots and observers can characterize anomalous phenomena, even if they don't know what they're seeing. They can describe it and they can characterize it.
So that makes World War II a pretty interesting starting ground for the encounter with UAP because not only are they actively searching for the things that we eventually do find, not just like terrestrial technologies or like familiar German technologies, but there also isn't this stigma against having seen a strange thing. There's like an expectation that pilots
Right.
are going to come back, or at least a hope that they'll come back and say, "Yeah, I did see something really unusual, and here's my description of it." So they saw a bunch of German tech. I guess Germans were experimenting with rockets and different plane designs, and the Japanese were. Uh, and this is where Foo Fighters.
Rocket propel fighters, jet propel fighters, air-to-air weapons, radio guided weapons, radar guided weapons, television guided, dozens of different types of missiles and rockets for air defense, for ground attack. So there was a host of, and I think what you really should gain to that is that it's being taken seriously because you are in an adversarial environment. You know there's a threat. There's no question about there being a threat. It's just, can you catch on to that threat before it hurts you too badly? So there was quite a motivation. There's no, oh, gee, that's interesting. It's no, that's interesting to the extent that if I don't get it right, it'll kill me.
It's a very different scenario than we have now with, airline pilots or something. So this is when we start encountering Foo Fighters. Are those then like the first, not UAP? I mean, I guess German rockets were a UAP at the time, but these are one of like the lasting UAP that continue to be unidentified or whatever, anomalous.
Foo Fighters kind of tend to stand out in the mix because they're nighttime reports, so they're largely lights. Whereas if I get a British recon pilot flying a photo Spitfire over Western France, and he observes a V1 guided rocket launch and describes it in daylight, it's unknown, it is anomalous, but it's obviously solid. It's not just a light. So it's easier to deal with, whereas the Foo Fighters kind of remain mysterious. But the Foo Fighters and the Foo Fighters tended to get more press attention because of that, and because it is kind of sensational, we have no idea what it is. It gets talked about a lot, but there were some very solid studies on the Foo Fighters from a military standpoint, even then, of, you know, is this real or is this a psychological effect? And they started doing there was some interesting analysis of, where the Foo Fighter sightings began.
Tell us about
And
that. Where do they begin and what are the
well, they
kind
began in Germany, in Germany, basically aircraft flying over France towards Germany for nighttime attacks, but they moved on, and the Foo Fighter effect, if you will. Then there were reports from Italy, and then ultimately there were reports from Japan. Uh, so again, it's one of those things where it was taken seriously on all the fronts, as it were, but it was never really resolved. Uh, it just and it's interesting to the fact that the intelligence community got frustrated with it. Unlike these other reports where we can accumulate the data and profile it, feed it back into the system, and have people looking and see more of what we're looking for, that never happened. And the joint intelligence bodies who were consolidating the data started pushing back and saying, look, I've got serious things to do with serious threats. Has anybody ever seen a Foo Fighter attack anything?
Hmm.
Okay. Do I have any reports for certain? One or two? Okay. I've got 500 Foo Fighters and maybe one or two where it actually appeared to be hostile. Don't send me any more. If
So they're
it's not
consistently
hostile, that's not my
non-hostile?
major problem.
They're consistently not hostile? That's the pattern?
Right. And
Yeah.
so it's sort of like, again, my job is to focus on threats. If this doesn't fall within a threat profile, it's not that it's not interesting, but it's clogging the channels. And even at that point in time during the war, the pushback was, I'm getting so many reports of Foo Fighters, mysterious lights, that I can't do my real work. And so I don't want to hear any more. And until tell me they're hostile, you know, don't disturb me,
Was
which
there
is
a
something.
theory of the case for them about what Foo Fighters were once they got to this point?
Well,
They're like,
see,
they're not hostile.
there's so many. It give you an example. On these nighttime raids, the bomber streams were dropping numerous types of flares to guide the bomber streams.
Mhm.
Okay. And so you've got lights coming down from the bomber streams. The Germans are dropping flares to highlight the bomber streams and make them visible to night fighters. You've got new anti-aircraft weapons of all types that, are blowing up, producing lights, fragmenting, producing lights. You have things like the new German rocket-powered fighters. Okay. You've got jet fighters on afterburner. I mean, there's so many things that create lights. If that's all you've got, uh, and the lights themselves don't do any damage. They're just reported in the distance, or maybe they're close to the aircraft, or maybe they come close to the aircraft. But you also have ionization effects, or whatever. The point is, there was nothing. It's the same thing that we're stuck with now to some extent. There was never enough data to profile a single Foo Fighter that you could associate with hostile action. Uh, if that had occurred, yeah, were there incidents? I'll give you an example. There were incidents of pilots that reported like little balls of light dropping on the aircraft and impacting the aircraft and causing damage. Well, then they determined that the Germans had developed aerial mines.
Oh, interesting.
Like, yeah, um, and
They're just on balloons or something? And a plane hits
parachutes.
it? Okay, I see.
If you think about it, to some extent, if you've got a stream of bombers and you can fly over them. So the Germans were trying so many different things. That in itself was a confusion factor. So some they did resolve, but others they didn't. So to answer your question, no, unlike the V1s and the V2s and the rocket fighters and the jet fighters, which all got profiled and essentially resolved in the end, the Foo Fighters were never resolved, generically speaking.
And at the end of the war, then, well, so I guess first the question is, are Foo Fighters the only unresolved class of UAP that come out of World War II?
Correct. From an intelligence security standpoint. Now, of course, there's another class of, and by the way, the common term for the jets and the rockets and the new type of anti-aircraft weapons and all that sort of thing, the term that is used for that generally is called Wunderwaffe. In other words,
Wunderwaffe. Yeah. Okay.
German wonder weapons, basically.
Hmm. So we knew that there were these Wunderwaffe out there, rockets
And
and
we and
things.
we started recovering them as the troops advanced and that sort of thing. And the Germans were experimenting with so many different designs because development within Germany was so fragmented between different bureaus and different political factions. There were dozens and dozens of things that never got anywhere.
Hmm.
In fact, during the last few months of the war, the Germans were trying desperately to shut down projects so they could concentrate their efforts. I don't need 20 types of anti-aircraft rockets. Give me two that really work, okay, in some quantity. That's what I need. So but the reason I say that is there were also, and not at the time, but later on, there were another class of Wunderwaffe weapons that were written about that became the precursors to UFOs in the late 40s and 50s. In other words, these were German weapons that maybe were concepts that were developed to some extent. They never got fielded. Rumors, gossip, the same, you'll find it in the literature, the fact that the Germans had atomic weapons.
Hmm.
We're now at the point in time, if you want to find anything about World War II, there's so much that's been written that, so I've got to discriminate what the intelligence community actually identified and dealt with
At the
versus
time, yeah.
what you will find in books about German wonder weapons that, nobody actually wrote about at the time, but a few years later, it's like, well, we had anti-gravity. They had anti-gravity. They had this
Like
other
you're
stuff.
saying they had anti-gravity?
No, no, sorry.
Oh, you're saying that you can
There are
find it.
authors that write about the fact that this is what they had, and that became the UFOs. A milder case of that, if you go down in time, when the first sightings occurred in the late 40s, the first intelligence community appraisal was because what was being reported were very high speed aircraft with a certain profile. Uh, the assessment was that this could have been advanced German air technology that the Germans never actually implemented operationally, that the Russians took and implemented. And so we're really looking at advanced Russian aircraft based on German technology.
So,
That that was primarily the Horton brothers Delta Wing craft with jets on them. That was a very real thing in the intelligence community. This other stuff that I just mentioned, no, that's in the speculative UFO literature. Let's put it that way.
so this other class of UAP that you're talking about, these are the Wunderwaffe, the swept wing aircraft and things that do look really weird. I mean, if anybody wants to look up a Horton Brothers plane, it's a bizarre looking craft. It has one wing that just goes through the whole thing, which could look disc-like. Yeah. So when we come out of the war, it seems like we do have a kind of nascent concept of UAP, uh, but it's not a serious issue for them, right? Because we've won the war. We think we know almost everything that we saw. We know what it was, except for these lights, these strange lights things. And it sounds like you're saying at the kind of high level of the intelligence world, the theory is just like there are weird lights in war. There's all sorts of flares and stuff. So we don't really have to take it that seriously. If it had been a technology, it would have done some damage to us, or we would have found one on the ground or something.
Right, exactly, because we found so much on the ground. I mean, we brought back V2s, we brought back ballistic missiles, and we're testing them at White Sands. We brought back jet fighters, we brought rocket fighters back. So we kind of think that we understand the advanced German technology. We brought back tons and tons of material and sent it to Wright-Patterson.
So
So
there's like
there's
a
a huge
like
body of,
recovery programs are already exist
yeah,
at this point. We've built this infrastructure for recovering not only their technology, but I guess our technology, because we want to recover like spy camera satellites and cartridges of film and things like
right.
that that might have landed. So how does
And
that
that is a good point. That continued, Mike. I will say this recovery program continued. We During the Korean War, we had a very active field intelligence effort to recover, say, the first Russian jet fighters that were being used in Korea.
Mhm.
We not inside Russia, but they're using, if they're sending stuff to Korea to use it, we want to recover that. And that those programs continued and continued on in time. Later, the Air Force would have teams that were devoted to recovering satellites overseas. Wherever it crashes, you got to be in there and try to revolt covertly, if at all possible. So field recovery efforts and teams that started during World War II, but continues to current day. I mean, that's the way you do it for intelligence collections. And if you always the best way to do it is to get the other guy's technology without them knowing you got it, right?
So that's a thing that's still going on in the intelligence world for tech
Right.
recovery.
And it's still classified. I think now Kevin Randall did a great job of writing uh, articles on the evolution of various units within the Air Force over time during the 50s, 60s, how those units, different groups were tasked and organized to do those kind of crash recoveries. I mean, crash recoveries are real, but crash recoveries of real stuff are real and documented. And yeah, there were teams that were set up to go do that. Uh, so that definitely has continued. Now, I'm sure those teams still exist, but when you pass a certain point in time, those documents are no longer, in 50 years, we'll know what they are now, right?
So take us up to the end of the now start at the end of World War II. We're getting close to like the first what we think of as a UFO. Is Kenneth Arnold and Roswell like where it starts, and where does the intelligence world become actually interested in what we now think of as UFOs?
It's kind of interesting because post World War II, actually the intelligence community, uh, the first exposure is not in the United States. It's in Europe. And it's the first there's a strategic intelligence group before the CIA, before the Air Force is even formed as a unit, before it's the Air Force, while it's still the Army Air Force. We're in an interim period, post World War II, 46, 48, 45, 46, early 47. And suddenly there are these spate of reports of things that sound very much like these German weapons, ballistic missiles, uh, uh, jet-powered missiles, V1s, V2s, and they're landing in Denmark, or they're being observed in Denmark and Sweden, and they're being observed, something with a long trail behind it that looks like a missile, something that crashes into a lake, that and the U.S. becomes very interested. Obviously, the locals are interested too, but both Britain and the US become very interested in those because the immediate question is, gee, what are the Russians? We know what we're doing with the German technology we captured. What are the Russians doing with the German technology they captured? Are they going to be ahead of us? And do they actually have enough nerve and enough confidence to launch these things into neutral countries? Is that what's really going on? And so there were covert intelligence projects that I write about in my book, actually between both Britain and the U.S. to go in and examine what was happening in those. These were called ghost rockets.
Mhm.
This is called the ghost rocket era of UFOs, if you will, and to deal with this and do intelligence assessments. And the first formal assessment of this new strategic intelligence group pre-CIA was that the Russians were indeed testing these things. And in some cases, they were going off course. But what was being reported was most likely Russian testing of German technologies, and which kind of sets the stage for the U.S. to be worried post Kenneth Arnold in 47 and 48 is, okay, if they were gutsy enough to be testing them over neutral countries in Europe, are they gutsy enough to be testing them over the U.S. or flying them over the U.S. or what? how far might they have advanced this? And you actually see one report that's referred to within the intelligence community that the Soviets might already have a fleet of several hundred Horton jet-powered long-range uh, flying bombers, and that if this really is true, they would be in an excellent position. Again, the fear at the time was that the Red Army was going to move west and that they were building an air force, an advanced air force to support that. So there was there was grave concern. I will say the intelligence estimates during that period of time and the concern was Russian.
And that's a public concern too. That's not just
Oh, that's totally within the Air Force. Again, you use the word lens. There's two totally different views of threats
hmm.
always. Again, as I say, the military and security community is only concerned if it's a threat. If it's a scientific phenomena, this is not our problem. It's only when we consider that it might be a threat, it's our job, right? So you'll find, and you can trace two totally separate streams of communications. One inside the Air Force,
Hmm.
and by the 50s, the CIA, and totally looking at it seriously as the possibility of it as a reconnaissance, which is what they assumed it was, especially reconnaissance of atomic sites by the Russians, and a whole series of communications through Air Force public relations that says it's all misidentifications, and the generals are lining up behind it going, oh, our pilots are just seeing reflections in the windscreen, so totally compartmentalized streams of communications. You don't, the big concern by 1952 is if the public gets to be too sensitized to this and too scared about this, what they're going to do is the same thing that happened to us with the Foo Fighters in Germany. There are going to be so many reports, so much garbage introduced into the system that we won't be able to tell the real from the not real, and that is dangerous. Which reports are, and it essentially becomes a tool of your enemy when you can't discriminate real reports from misidentifications. So
And that
that's
happened in
always the
52.
dichotomy that emerges.
That happens in 52, right? When we have this
Correct.
flap over DC, the telephone lines get tied up with so many
Yeah.
people reporting out of some anxiety. And I guess at that point, the public anxiety over Russia or Russian weapons or something might have
Yeah.
existed enough that people are freaking out about it. And that's what really triggers is that what triggers the security state to care about UFOs, because it has this potential to be like the American people can be hoaxed by it or something like.
Well, it opens you up to two things. It overrides your channels with noise,
Mhm.
so you can't respond if there's a real attack, you know. Uh, and it also is a form of psychological warfare that you're conducting on yourself,
Hmm.
adding an element of uncertainty, doubt, can we defend ourselves? Should we increase nobody begins to, well, can we really trust the Air Force? I saw one and I know it's real and they keep telling me it's not. And I know what's real and what isn't. So you begin to mistrust the official lines of communication too. So it can be used as a form of psychological warfare. In fact, if you can play the cards right, you can do a lot of damage without even having a real weapon.
So is the intelligence world trying to like suppress a serious interest in UAP because they don't want to put themselves in a position of just like freaking themselves out over nothing, or not knowing what to be freaked out about? Is that kind of one of the incentives there?
Well, that by 1952, that's what happened. Now, during the interim period, that wasn't that wasn't the real thing. That wasn't the real concern. And you weren't didn't have that many reports. I mean, you had hundreds of reports. 1952 becomes a year where everything goes off the charts. And so suddenly, if you're intelligence, you're going, well, wait a minute, were these prior years were they just preparing for this? And now they've opened the floodgates, and now really, are we going to see this in 1953? Are we going to see it? Is this a precursor?
Hmm.
Is this actually a warning? But no, in the interim years, 47 to 50, it was, and it's more like trying to maintain control over the information so that if there was a new Russian development or whatever, you could see it versus the noise. Clearing the signal from the noise was all their concern. So they want, it's not that they don't want a good signal, but quite frankly, that's why the signal that they expect to see comes from within the military community, within the people that are most likely to be able to differentiate what is anomalous from what isn't. So it's not that they didn't want, that's why they set up a reporting system within, so it's not that they didn't want reports.
False
It
positives. That's what
yeah.
they are trying to avoid is a ton of false positives. So
And that's why they set up officers at almost every military base. At least some poor lieutenant would get assigned to being the first filter point. Like, okay, you got to, you know, don't report it to Wright-Patterson unless you've got to fill out this worksheet. But it was a very structured and organized way of collecting information. And of course, you had to open it up to the public too. At that point in time, because the public was concerned. So you had to give the public a place to report it to. Kind of interesting to contrast it now, because here, 70 years later, we're back in the same phenomena, and AARO, and we set up channels to collect reports again, which didn't exist for the last 3 decades. Now we're collecting them again, but pretty much only from the military.
mm,
It's like, no, we haven't gone back to, it's not open anymore. And you can imagine these days, to some extent, why that's true. If I can report an incident by the internet, and that's all it takes, and that's my first field point. Tomorrow afternoon I'll have 1,000, and
yeah,
how can I deal with them
somebody
possibly?
can just write a program that'll spam the reporting
Yeah,
portals with
you would
hundreds
be
of thousands.
swamped, and
Yeah.
more reports that's not necessarily good. So anyway, so that is something that's different. But going back to the time period we're talking about, they were concerned, and it's interesting. The first assessment, I think, got to be on record. The first official intelligence estimate of the situation from the Air Force at the end of 1947 is that what was being reported was real. These were real objects with anomalous flight characteristics, and they actually, in the memos, they publish the profile. So yes, they're real. And by the way, let's go look for these, because this is what we need to, it's a new collections directive. Let's go find it. And the interesting thing is, in 1948, they were absolutely certain they knew where to find it. They absolutely were certain they would find it in German tech taken by the Russians.
Hmm.
And they went to look for those Horton flying wings, and they took the investigation because they truly believed that's what they were seeing. Jet powered or rocket powered Horton aircraft. The only concern was, how would they have the range to get over the US? Did they have secret bases, whatever? And so we have a project. At first it's called Project Sign, which
Mhm.
everybody says there's no meaning to these names, but it's kind of like, well, intuitively, they have a sign, they have a signal, and they're following it, and they can't find it. The people that are project, they can't resolve it. And so by 48, 49, sign has become grudge, which I still don't think is sheer, like, circumstantial, because everybody that was involved in Project Sign gets reassigned to other tasks. The scientific advisors kind of have their careers tanked, and suddenly we've got a new set of people, and it becomes very clear. And this is written with remarks from people inside Blue Book, which evolved from this later. It's kind of like, you really understood that if you wanted to keep your job and your rank, you would find reports that you could identify.
Hmm.
Nobody is really looking for problems anymore. This is not a sign. Misidentification rules. So if there's any possibility at all, don't feed stuff into the system unless if you can filter it out, filter it out.
So it's a
And so
really
that's
perverse
when we,
incentive. Like, you don't want to create an institution that incentivizes your people to give you bad information just because they're afraid of losing their rank or like
Yeah.
never being promoted again. But
And
that's
what am I
exactly
going
what
to
we're
do? I'm a lieutenant at Wright-Patterson, and I just heard the general at Washington D.C. say, "Well, these are all mistakes our pilots are making, and they're nothing. What am I going to do?" I'm sitting here, it's kind of like, "Sir, I have this new report for you." No, no, not that. Just doesn't make sense. So that takes us kind of from 1947 through 1949, and then it just kind of assumes a life. It's the numbers go down, and the interesting where the higher quality reports do start being generated from Los Alamos and Sandia Base, and the atomic development sites. It, they don't want to hear what they have to say. Actually, you can trace the thing in the documents where local army contingents, army groups, scientific personnel, FBI are writing letters to the Air Force saying, "We really think you should look into this," and it's like nobody wants to hear them.
yeah.
And you start. It's fascinating phenomena, but that's what's going on. As the reports are getting better, the response to the reports is getting worse.
So I'm surprised we haven't talked about Roswell. How does Roswell fit into this? Like, is your theory just that whatever happened there, the intelligence world was like not interested, it's got to be a mogul balloon or whatever the hell?
Roswell, as far as we can determine, Roswell had no impact on anything.
In the
Uh,
intelligence world, you
There's
mean?
just there's nothing in the system. Yes, it was reported. Uh, you know, whatever was picked up there, certainly certainly it didn't change the response of the intelligence system. The system didn't take reports any more seriously, any less seriously. There's no sign that it was just one of many. And it was one of many, I will say, where crashes were reported and materials were reported as being collected. And in all cases, they were misidentifications, a lot of hoaxes, uh, but some just literally misidentifications. And Roswell was treated officially as a misidentification. Uh, the one thing I will say is, and I think it has to be there. There are obviously pro and con books written around Roswell, but the con books contain some interesting reports that would suggest that Roswell was indeed covered up because what was recovered was a sonobuoy. Now,
What?
if you've
What is
never
that?
heard what a sonobuoy is,
No.
sonobuoy is actually an acoustic detection device. It's used to pick up submarines. It's something the Navy would normally deploy to track submarines in that era during World War II, post World War II. So it's a sound monitoring or wave monitoring device, if you will,
So
whether
is this
it's
the Project Mogul explanation? Like I knew that that explanation is that there was a device that was being used by
yes.
Mogul to detect like nuclear tests by the Soviets.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Would be
Okay.
part of Project Mogul. And there are actually reports that, like, one report says that a team that was associated with Mogul that was flying back into Wright-Patterson, where they were stationed out of, was actually advised that somebody had recovered one of their sonobuoys.
Hmm.
And they went, "Oh, geez, somebody, if the press gets wind of this, somebody is going to ask why we were testing a Navy acoustic device out in the middle of the desert. That's interesting, and they'll tumble to obviously what we're doing, that we're looking for. So there was a good deal of concern that if that got into the press, you would have revealed one of, like at the time it was felt that this was probably going to be your best tool to detect the first Soviet atomic explosions. Now we know that it wasn't, but then, right, you're in the middle
It
of
just didn't
something.
work well. Is that what we found out?
Um, the what it proves is these air channels that at certain within the atmosphere were not conducting the waves. You
Hmm.
you could detect the waves just as easily with other instruments
Hmm.
through seismic, ground seismic monitoring. There was nothing particularly unique about it. It was thought that there was a unique layer the atmosphere that would conduct these waves better than anything else. And as it turned out, compared to actually doing air sampling, which actually you could seismically, you could detect the blast and then you could pick up the samples.
You mean
And
like
that lets you,
radiation?
yeah, well, not just radiation, but particulate matter,
Hmm.
which allowed you to determine how the bomb was built
Oh,
and
interesting.
really what kind of bomb it was,
What
gave you much
detonation
more
method it
information.
used or something, right? Is that what you're saying? Like we could know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So I only toss that out to your question to say at the time, Roswell appears to have made no impact. It was just another report. And I think the interesting point is, from this standpoint, it would have been a report of something real that was covered up with a PR effort. What was shown to the public wasn't what was collected, which is the story about Roswell, right? So you can have it either way. There was a cover up. It just depends on what you're covering up.
Yeah, there's no non-cover up theory of Roswell, right?
Yeah.
But whatever it is, it's a cover up of something.
So that's always the toughest thing. It's kind of like we know there's something suspicious going on because there's a cover up. Now, what was it?
Yeah. So okay, so 52 is where you say it kind of everything hits the fan. Is it just the flap in 52 over Washington D.C.? Like why does it hit the fan and what are the effects on the
No,
intelligence?
it started early on in 52, well before Washington, D.C. In fact, um, interestingly enough, uh, Project Blue Book, the Air Force had been advised early in the year that it might see a wave of reports, a real burst in reports, because there were some large scale air defense exercises planned for the East Coast.
Hmm.
And of course, whenever you're flying bomber, it's kind of like people are going to do misidentifications.
Sure.
So to some extent, they were expecting it. But what started happening was they started getting reports from the East Coast that weren't related to the defense exercises. It's just like, wait a minute, okay, we thought something was going to happen, and something is happening, but there are all of these radar tracks over New York City, I mean, up and down the East Coast. Lots of interceptors deployed, lots of attempted engagements, lots of UFOs reported by pilots well before DC. It's just that it only got local newspaper coverage, but it was building. It's kind of like this visibility to UFOs is building during the first 6 months of the year. But part of the effect is also, and understandable, the Korean War was ramping down. A lot of the interceptors, I mean, in 52, we had a level of radar deployment and interceptor deployment in the US, continental US, that we had never had before. Because in the earlier years, 50, that stuff was all going to Korea and Japan because we're in another war. Now we're bringing it home. We're setting up an air defense system. So you would expect there would be more reports
Mm-hmm.
and more intercepts. We're really getting organized with a much better air defense system. So you'd expect you would generate more reports. Okay, fine.
So how does
The
that become?
reason
Go ahead. Sorry.
the reason that DC stood out literally because it was the capital, two things, was the capital, and because the Air Force air defense response was so poor uh, that it got a lot of press coverage. Hey, it's like the headline is, commercial pilots and military pilots see UFOs over the Capitol and can't deal with them. It's like, wait a minute, they're not only being reported, as it turns out, the Air Force, because of some runway issues, whatever, was not getting interceptors over the Capitol for an hour.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
should this not worry somebody? Should the president not worry? Should, like these things are reported, and we can't reassure you because they're by the time they're getting here, they're gone. Or if they get here, as soon as they get here, they're gone. And you sort of would worry because nobody is effectively dealing with them. In a way, it's sort of like fast forward to 2024,
Hmm.
and we have drones over Norfolk, we have drones over Langley, and nobody's dealing. I mean, to some extent, it's almost like if there wasn't a lot of other stuff going on, we should be doing a revisit of 1952 right now
Sure, but
because there
the
are so
political
many.
world drowns it out
Yeah,
completely.
the political world rounds it out. Yeah, but it's sort of like it, the chief of NORAD yesterday announced that in since 2022 we've had over 600 drone incidents over our military bases.
Wow.
And in no single incident has a drone, like a UAP, been engaged and brought down or effectively responded to in any way. Now, in 1952, that sort of statement would have caused an utter panic. And now it's so swamped by the political news, it's like, oh, okay, fine, not a problem. Um, should I
600,
be
that's
worried?
incredible. Well, can you tell us just quickly tell us the story of the 1952 flap so everybody understands what we're talking about?
What really happened, this occurred in July, two separate days over a 2 or 3 week period, is starting with commercial airline pilots, because obviously DC and New York, it's a metro area. It has a lot of air traffic control, a lot of flights coming and going. So commercial pilots started reporting lights. Okay, we're back to lights at night. But unlike those lights, they're also tracked on radar. And in many instances, the radar operators are tracking what the commercial airline pilots are reporting. So now we don't just have a light, we have a light that's being tracked on radar. There's something, you would think, a physical object there. And the radar operators are all highly professional, and they will swear after the fact that what they're seeing is not uh, it's not an atmospheric effect. It's real. These are real things. Okay. And so because the airline pilots are reporting them, it's going to get to the press. You know, they're being seen, and it's an aircraft safety hazard. It's an air defense problem, and the Air Force isn't coming up with an answer. It has no good immediate. Matter of fact, the Air Force flies the head of Blue Book, Ruppelt, down to DC to brief the head of the. It's like, tell me what's going on, and he has no answers,
Mm.
and he never has any answers because they can't solve it. Okay, now here's the interesting thing. So after a while, there are no more reports, and as usual, the news story dies down. But what we know actually happened at that point, because we have the document, is the president called a special meeting. We don't know what was said in the meeting. It would be really fun to have a tape of that. But the title of the meeting is Defense of the Capitol.
Oh my.
Now you got to think, when the president calls a meeting and calls the Air Force into a meeting called Defense of the Capitol, somebody is going to get their butt chewed. I
Yes.
mean, there's just no doubt about that. Like, you know, guys, what do I tell the public? Well, sir, we don't know. We really don't know. Can you make me feel better about this? Not really. So following that, the he obviously asked them for a better response. They go away and don't really come back with much of a response, because they come back and they go back and look at the garage report, and they're coming back with the same stories: misidentifications, a radar, atmospheric conversions. It was all temperature inversions.
But that
And
doesn't
the
create
radar
light.
operators.
That would could create a radar signature, but so you don't have any real theory that explains why you would see both a radar signature and lights at the same time. Are they in
Right.
airspace that nothing is supposed to be in, or is this normal civilian airspace?
This is space that it would be strictly under air traffic control.
Okay.
Nothing is supposed to be in it unless it's in communication with air traffic control. And this is at a period of time, you've got to remember, where we have air defense zones set up around the nation. No flight goes anywhere, commercial or private, without filing a flight plan, and if it's shows up at a place and time where it's, interceptors get scrambled, we're taking air defense seriously, because quite frankly, the first atomic attack, strategic intelligence had predicted 2 years earlier that the Soviets would stage a preemptive atomic attack in 52.
Why?
Then it, then
I
it
mean,
became
why would they?
53. Yeah.
Why would that? I mean, that's terrifying. This was obviously wasn't public knowledge, but in
No, it was
19,
not public knowledge.
so in
But we have all
1950, they thought
it's
that,
all documented. That was based on predictions of A, when they would have built enough atomic weapons, B, when they would have had enough long range bombers, and we know they had both. And I mean, you make assumptions about what they can do, and the assumption was that they would stage an attack to at least take out our nuclear capability, because in terms of parity, they had absolute superiority in ground forces. Our only defense was our atomic shield. So if they could take out our atomic weaponry and the major parts of our of strategic air command, we would be back at parity. They felt themselves under threat. We felt ourselves under threat. That's the way the game gets played. But no, that's why the Air Force would be taking it very seriously. And that's why this immense air defense system had been put into place. Absolute rush. You see the old films, and they're building the radar stations across northern Canada and up in the Arctic, and spending extraordinary amounts of time and materials and to build this shield against a Russian attack. And yet we're doing all of this, and I just saw the newsreels about the dew line up in the Arctic, and what are these things over the Capitol? How did they get here? So the president is taking it very seriously. The Air Force really doesn't give him any all he really wants to know is there a real threat or is there not? It's a good one way or the other. He's not comfortable with what the Air Force says. He hands it off to the CIA. The CIA assigns their technical intelligence group to it, and their first response is to agree with the Air Force. It's misidentification, it's not real. But then when they start studying the data and looking at the patterns in the data, they come back and the head of that group says, yeah, there are patterns of UFO activity over all of our atomic bases in the Southwest, Hanford, Los Alamos, Kirtland, and we're really worried. And in fact, we're so worried, director of the CIA, you need to take this to the Joint Chiefs. We're going to need a crash program to deal with this. And the director of the CIA says, well, okay, okay. At this point in time, you agree with the Air Force, and we're going to take this. Did we just lose our signal?
yeah, I don't know what's going on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Okay, now you're back.
Strange. I don't know what that was.
It got blurry all of a sudden. We
Yeah.
might have had a little power glitch, but nothing went off. Anyway,
And
okay.
okay. So let's just back up. So
Okay.
you were saying that they call a meeting with the Joint Chiefs and say,
Well, that's the CIA director is advised that should happen.
okay,
His
oh, we
people are
should call
telling
it.
him this needs to be elevated to a level of a strategic threat. Okay. So that would mean normally that it would be taken to the Joint Chiefs. Well, everything's still even complex. It's more complex today, but back then, the Joint Chiefs has its own intelligence advisory group. So the CIA director has got to take it to them, and they've got to agree to it before it goes on an agenda with the Joint Chiefs. And the pushback is, we'll accept your recommendations for a study if you can bring along scientific advisors that will confirm that there's something really anomalous in play. It's not now. You would think, like, okay, the fact that this could be Russian reconnaissance aircraft or whatever would be enough, but they want to push this further. It's sort of like, wait a minute, we want to. You're saying that these devices, this UFOs, are actually not just plain regular aircraft. They have capabilities beyond anything that we're aware of, and they might not even be terrestrial.
What were the
You don't know
capabilities
what.
they were seeing? What made them draw that conclusion?
Um, Basically, the acceleration, the speeds, the maneuverability. Quite frankly, the same things that were profiled back in 1947 haven't changed any. They still have all those. There's not an interceptor that we have that can stay with them. I mean, a classic case out of that period of time. Someone reports a UFO coming over the Canadian border out of Canada. Could have come across the Arctic, whatever. It's moving at a very high rate of speed. It's being tracked on radar. It comes down, and we launch interceptors to engage it. The interceptors approach it. It immediately reverses course. And when I say immediately, I mean immediately.
So it just
The
reversed.
interceptors go on full afterburner and can't stay with it. It's leaving them. And these are our best interceptors. Okay. Um, the interceptors have to turn back because they're on a full afterburner. They've only got minutes.
Running out of
So
fuel.
they turn back. The UFO turns around and starts following them back towards their base. We scramble another set of interceptors. Same thing happens. So this would be there's a whole series of incidents like this where these whatever they are UFOs have speed and maneuver. They just have capabilities. They're either we don't know what they are. You
And
know.
it seems like if it was just um, one capability that was perplexing, we could think that it's some advanced technology that somebody else has figured out.
Mhm.
But when it's an object that can not only accelerate, you know, orders of magnitude faster than you can, that can maneuver in ways that you don't understand, and that can stay aloft for like extraordinary amounts of time without refueling or whatever, you kind of think that it's really improbable that one of our, enemy states has made all these series of technological
Yeah.
breakthroughs because it's plausible that they made one, but this would require several.
And no manned aircraft that we know of made out of the materials that we know could survive that kind of deceleration and acceleration,
Oh, right. Yeah. So it's pulling so many G's that it should like tear itself apart or
yeah.
something. I think like our fighter jets can survive like 12 or 13 G's or something before
Yeah,
they
I mean,
flat.
certainly we can. You can look at an artillery shell or something like that that can take thousands of Gs. That's not. That's we built uh, anti-aircraft rockets like that during World War II. But these are very dense, very compact devices with uh, solid state essentially. But they're not a manned aircraft. They're
It's just
not.
a lump
Yeah,
of material versus a
yeah.
an engine that's got to like have sensitive parts and maybe people in it. That seems like a
So
limit
the,
on
the,
how
the
many.
problem is if I'm going to take this story to the Joint Chiefs, they're going to ask me what kind of a threat is it? These Russians? And we're going to say, I don't really know because it does we have not found anything that the Russians have that can do this. So we don't know who it is. And they're going to laughably say, so it's aliens, right? And we're going to say, well, I don't know. Politically speaking, this is not a good dialogue to have. So the the advisors to the Joint Chiefs say, all right, director of the CIA, we'll put you on the agenda if, along with your briefing people, you will bring us some credible name brand physicists, scientists who will confirm what you're telling us.
So it seems
And
like this.
then we get the Robertson panel, which is
Okay.
famous to everybody who knows UFOs. And the CIA and the Air Force try to slam together this panel. It's a very long story, but in the end, the point is they can't get any physicist or scientist who will put their reputations on the line with this story.
Yeah.
And so
But
it goes no further. It doesn't go to the Joint Chiefs. It doesn't go to strategic intelligence, as it were. It stays within the Air Force. And Blue Book continues to do what Blue Book was doing before. You get a report, you treat one report at a time, you get another report, and there's no strategic analysis. Strategic threat and warnings analysis occurs way up on the pyramid under the Joint Chiefs and the CIA. Threat and assessment warnings, there's special teams for that. They never get tasked with this. And so Blue Book can, so there's no long-term pattern analysis. Interestingly enough, the CIA, the Air Force and the CIA both were convinced by the fall of 52 that they had seen enough data just in the last year or so to see patterns that were of concern. And they did look at it and they said, and by the way, we really want to track these things, we need to set up instruments out there in New Mexico, do this or that. But that also went away. So no further high level pattern studies were kicked off.
because
So
because the high level people wanted confirmation from like persuasive scientists who were famous and who didn't have like a stake in the
yeah,
military sort of world. No scientists were willing to like take on that job. So they say, you're saying it's probably not Russia. We don't have to worry about it in that way, at least. So go back and treat one report at a time, and the incentives are then file each report as a misidentification because nobody wants to like be stuck in their job forever because somebody's mad at them that they
yeah.
said that it was a.
I mean, there are really two things at play. One is it's an institutional problem.
Mhm.
Nobody wants to rest their reputation without absolute concrete proof. Where do you get it? And can somebody challenge it? And as Dr. Hynek said, there is no UFO report that will ever be generated of an object in the air or whatever that somebody can't come up with a possibility to explain it. It's just
Sure.
sort of like even during the Condon Commission in the late 60s, when academic scientists, one of their reports says, this describes a phenomena that has never been reported prior to this and is unlikely to ever be seen after. It's like, wait a minute, hold on. Uh,
How could you know that? Yeah, that's so frustrating.
it's like somebody can always come up with an answer, even if it's that kind of answer.
Yeah.
And so basically, for whatever reason, institutionally, that was kind of the end of that era of 1952, led to the fact that the concern that came out of the Robertson panel was what we talked about earlier. You know, if we allow this to continue, 1953 could have even more reports. We could truly be setting ourselves up for a Russian surprise attack. And by the way, maybe that's what they're doing. Maybe they're trying to set us up. Maybe so we've got to dial down. If anything, we've got to dial down the reporting. We've got to dial down the sensitivity. Uh, it was looked at as a potential psychological warfare, uh, not as a. And the other thing that went along with it, we've got to be fair, is from the Air Force's standpoint and from the military standpoint in general. These reports in toto did not represent a threat.
Mhm.
Nothing was being attacked. No, yeah, were there aircraft losses? Yeah, there were interceptors that went up in bad weather, especially all weather interceptors that came down in pieces or were lost and not recovered. So it's not that there weren't losses, but actually connecting them to hostile action, no hostile action could be confirmed. And it's just kind of like with the Foo Fighters that we discussed. Over a period of time, if no hostile action is confirmed, I can't classify it as a threat.
Yeah,
And if I
you
can't
just
classify it as a threat, it's not part of my job. I got to worry about the things that are threats.
this so you're helping me piece this together too because my initial thought was like, well, if you are stuck with the conclusion that there is something that is more sophisticated, more advanced than what we have, and you're really worried about Russia, how do you ever stop worrying about the threat? But it seems like the answer is at least partially that this flies in the face of our theory about Russia's will to be aggressive or will to like destroy us, because if they were in possession of this,
Yeah,
they would have already just taken
exactly.
America out completely. So it can't be Russia. It just
And
doesn't.
if that was the counter argument, it's sort of like if they have atomic weapons carriers with these kind of abilities, a first strike would be child's play to
Yeah.
them. So no, they haven't done it. So it's probably not them.
So at
So
at a
and
personal
and we
level,
have no other sign that it is them.
yeah,
We haven't identified these things. We
we don't
haven't
know where they're
not
coming
connected the
from.
dot.
They're showing up in places that we wouldn't expect Russian craft to show up. They're coming from Canada or whatever. Like, yeah, it just does not fit the Russia theory. So, like at an individual level, are the people who have looked at all this evidence, are they just stuck with the conclusion that like there are aliens flying craft around on Earth and we're not going to do anything about it because that's not our job? Is that's got to be a crazy situation to be in for your career.
To some extent, like Dr. Hynek, who was a consultant to Blue Book,
Hmm.
over time reached that conclusion. That he just, and he became, uh, for a long period of time, he was just a scientific advisor, and his job was to find reasonable explanations for, and you can. We know that 90% or better
Yeah,
of these,
sure.
they're quick, reasonable explanations, but he came across enough that were not reasonable that he had to conclude that, yeah, they're alien. Now, what alien means, I don't know, but it's not our
Not
technology.
human. We didn't make this. Nobody's made.
Yeah.
Is there any theory that um that it could be human technology because some societies are working like they're doing science in such a different way? Like to give an example, the Soviet Union is like an explicitly non-religious society. They and that impacts the way they do science, right? They were doing ESP research because there's not a taboo against it. Because if it's all just matter and no spirit, then maybe ESP is just like electromagnetism or something, and so we can do this research without feeling silly about it. Whereas in America, you do that research and you kind of get associated with like, you know, the spiritualist movement or people who have these taboo beliefs, but those taboos don't exist in Russia, so they can do science differently. Is there a worry that like some group of people that we're not even really paying attention to, like in Borneo or I don't know, just a place that's not even on the map, has made like some scientific breakthrough that we don't understand? Is that ever considered?
It's interesting. One of a fascinating science fiction story, short story I read at one point in time, follows along that line of thinking because they call several physicists into rooms at different places, different times, and they show them a picture, a movie, of this guy with a harness on, and he's flying. It's flying. It's anti-gravity,
Mhm.
clearly. Okay, and they're going, we collected this. This fellow wrote us a letter, said that he had made this great scientific discovery, and he wanted to share it with us. And by the time we followed up on him, it was dead. He passed away, heart attack, whatever. So all we've got are a few notes and his bookcase. We don't know what but with this film, we can prove to you he found something. So you guys need to go out and find it. And it kind of goes, so that blasted their preconceptions, right? I saw in the movie it can be done. And so 3 years later, these guys have got a 20-ton device that can lift itself 5 feet off the ground. Okay, because they know it can be done and it's going to get better. And then they're told, well,
We fake the
we
movie.
fooled you.
Yeah.
We knew that if you could get the blinders off, we knew that you could do it. But that's the whole premise, which is what you're talking about. Was that ever seriously considered? I don't think so, because this is just speaking of physical objects, that clearly were not, uh, they're not atmospheric craft, if you will. They're not playing the basic principles of aerodynamics. There's something going on radically. You just mentioned the fact that they can perform this over long periods of time. So whatever fuel source it is, that they just, if you look at the whole big picture of what they can do, it's it's not it's all physical, but it's way beyond anything we can see going on in Russia as far as their defense industry, the material space. There's just no correlation with the rest of their hard science. But you're talking about some areas from remote viewing on. That's a different story. But these are real physical objects. I mean, they're detectable on radar. You know, they're reflecting. So something's going on. So that doesn't work as well when you're talking with a physical object that is truly anomalous in terms of how it's lifting, moving, what energies are involved. I mean, we do have reports, radiation reports. There's something going on with hard science that there's no evidence that the Russians or anybody else has, or kind of like what we're seeing, or we would see it. I mean,
Sure.
why would you keep that sort of thing secret, even from a commercial standpoint?
Yeah.
You
Why
know,
would you lose any military, conflict that you were involved in if you had this?
And if
technology.
Boeing or Lockheed could do this, surely they would sell it to somebody,
Sure.
even if we would know about it, right? Okay, if they're, but be that as it may, there are all sorts of conspiracy theories that go there. But I would say within the intelligence community, it really was, even for those people working in the military, it's in two classes. It's kind of like almost all of this is misidentification. And what isn't is a threatening, non-hostile phenomena that's just not my job.
And it doesn't matter how crazy or like metaphysically groundbreaking, worldview shattering the truth may be. My job really is just to consider national security threats, and we've made the assessment that this isn't one. So, like, it's just, I can't do anything about it. That's the position they're all in.
And that's like, I don't want that is their day job. When they write memos and make reports and appear before meetings, they know that they're going to be evaluated in the job that they're supposed to be doing. Not, I mean, they may go off. It's interesting. There are a lot of these people that were associated with the intelligence community or Blue Book or whatever that joined NICAP,
Mm-hmm.
National Investigative Phenomena. They were interested in it, but that's their not day job.
Yeah.
They can, they're perfectly free to go and be very interested in it on their own. One of the first really active research groups to investigate it, where there were two of them. One were physicists from Los Alamos
Mhm.
who were absolutely convinced they were anomalous devices, probably alien, that set up their own research community, set up their own tools and their own systems. It was
Do I
called
know
the
about this?
probably not. It's in my book. Honest, it's in the Los Alamos Bird Watchers Association. Was the
Oh,
cute name for it.
interesting. That was really cute.
Uh, there was another group that formed among the aerospace community in Los Angeles, and Ruppelt at Blue Book would go out and meet with these people because so, but that was not their day job. That's and at the time the political system was that, well, you've got some interesting data, but I don't think it's going to be enough to move the pendulum. And by the way, do you have anything that shows they're hostile? No, just that they're really strange. And when Blue Book was closed in 1969, again, we've all got to be aware of what the Air Force really said. The Air Force really said, hey, I don't have concrete proof. The scientific community is not going to step up to this because it doesn't have concrete proof. And most importantly, we do not have a single instance of a verifiable hostile action, so it's not our job. Now, forward to 2022, 2023, AARO is meeting, and what do they say? Exactly the same thing. We have reports, a few of them are interesting, none of them are hostile. And the worst it gets, and the only reason we're still looking at it is some of them pose accidents. Some of them may involve aircraft. There may be an aviation risk.
A
That's
collision
why
or
we're
something.
looking at
Like,
them,
just
not because they're threats.
so this is kind of disheartening, but I guess on the one hand, you really do want an intelligence community that is just solely focused on questions about threats. And you don't want them to be sidetracked just because something's interesting. It that that's a
And
good
their
thing.
day is full. I mean, it's not
Oh,
like they
sure.
don't have enough threats to worry about,
Yes.
right? Is it Russian ICBMs or Iranian drones or Chinese drones or does somebody have a new technology? What about a hypersonic? It's not like their budget's not spread too thin already. So, you've got to give them that too. If I'm a manager, it's sort of like I got a list of 100 threats going here. You're really going to have some proof to make it 101 because you're going to want a budget if you do that, right?
Yeah.
And I'll need personnel, and I don't have any to spare.
And so that's one part of the one sort of pillar of the situation is that you do want this intelligence community that cares only about threats and ignores anything else. Uh, but then you would want what you would want is some other community that is interested in the stuff that aren't threats but are still interesting. but it seems like that just doesn't exist. It's not like the people who are in the intelligence community who are like, look, I'm convinced that this is something so bizarre and new and interesting that I want to like just switch and study that. So I'm going to go over here and do it. There's no here to go to. There's like no government office or civilian organization that has a budget and has access and all the things that it needs to do it. So it's just not an option. Like it's like our only option. The rationality of our system is such that the only option is to see if it's a threat. If it's not, you just shove it off the desk
Well,
and focus on the things that are real.
what they will say and what they have said in the past is if it could be a phenomena, could be you know, just
Atmosphere, whatever.
astronomical,
Yeah.
it could be whatever. That's up to the scientific community. That's
It's
what
not their
they do.
job. Yeah.
That's,
Yeah.
and by the way, it could be alien anthropologist, but that's still up to them. They need to do research grants. That it's not like they don't. It's not like there are not a lot of universities that have millions of dollars in grants to do physical research
Sure.
and have extremely expensive equipment. It's not like that community doesn't exist. So the defense community would say if it's non-threatening, it should be really interesting. We thought it was really interesting. And, you guys should look at the cases that we think are truly anomalous and go for it. But the academic community, again, because of there's certain institutional issues there as well. I mean, you got to look at the grants, where the grants come from, what the grants are for. A lot of the grants are for basic research that will go into commercial applications, whether it's medical or now some of it is pure science grants, but these days a lot of it is also environmental. Uh, so there's a lot of competition for those grants, and and even I was talking to one of our SCU folks, and like if we had to fund a grant for a top tier physicist to look into, you know, hyper warps, space warp, actually space warping to get a technology profile, what would it take? And he's going, well, first of all, they're going to expect three years.
Mhm.
Okay. And then here it goes through the numbers, sort of like, and okay, so if you can come up with a grant of, $300,000 a year for 3 years, you can capture one of those top tier people. Who's going to do that?
Yeah.
It's not like they don't have things to do. They're doing their own grants. So it is expensive. The other hurdle to that, there are two pieces of the hurdle to that. The academics would have to collect their own data, or private citizens would have to collect their own data, use their own instruments, whatever, because DoD, in most cases, cannot share data with them because sharing data is our classic problem. If I share the data, I also disclose the capability of what data I can
Yeah.
collect.
My collection
So
abilities.
the other guys know what I can and cannot see, and that's I'm not going to do that. So you're on your own. I cannot share that data with you, whether it's you know satellite or whatever. I can't share data, and it's even worse if you want me to share data on something that I'm still evaluating as a threat.
Yeah.
These drones that we're talking about here, I can't give you any more because I'm still evaluating them as a threat. So there's a real door or wall there between the data they're collecting and what we're going to get. So it really is, unless the scientific community stepped into it um, for a relatively few cases, not and had a way to parse those cases and look at it. There really is a wall, as you say. The pillar that you might expect on the other side is not there. I mean, it has the potential of being there, but it would have to. There would be something that would have to bring it into existence, because right now, just like with the defense folks focus on threat, the academic research community is already committed. It's not like there are any
Yeah.
slots waiting to be filled.
They have things to do. They have years worth of plans for their research, and nobody's like looking around waiting for a UFO research grant. I mean, maybe there are a few people. I'm sure there are people who would take it up, but in general, that's just not how academic research works. You want to
And
make sure.
it's going to have to be very advanced research, like I'm saying, and even the instrumentation may not be there. One of the things you're wrestling with is like, okay, what technology signatures do I have to collect to determine, what this might be? How anomalous is it? What energy levels are in play? What's going on? It's got to be a pretty complex program with extremely complex instrumentation, and then it's got to be lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time to do it. And how many department managers after they walk through that little exercise, so what are your odds of actually you want me to invest in, you know, three grad students and maybe three postdocs and you know $20 million worth of equipment. And now, how many of these incidents, what are your odds of actually getting an incident to study? Well, sir, here's the distribution that's a no, I don't think I'm going to do this. And by the way, once you get the first one, what are your odds of a second one?
Yeah,
So,
how many do you
I
need?
mean, do you know where they occur? Can you control the experiment? No, no, I can't. I'll just have to get lucky.
So we focus pretty granularly on the history up until like the Robertson panel, and it feels like we just kind of zoomed forward. Is that just because that's the situation has stayed the same the whole time?
That's pretty much it. I mean, when the Robertson panel left Blue Book in play to do what we were talking about, case by case by case. And can you ever find the perfect case? And as Hynek said, you can't ever find the perfect case because even as with the Condon Project, if they find it, they'll say, well, it's a one-time phenomena that occurs every 20 million years. Okay, what am I going to do? So Blue Book is gone. There's no longer, the Air Force is not investigating it. Um, here's what happened after that point in time. From a security and military standpoint, there is no body that's collecting a even the Air Force, a body of incidents that they're reviewing on a one-off basis. That's not even occurring.
Hmm.
If something really exceptional happens, let's say it's a report over an ICBM silo in Montana. What happens is a report goes to NORAD, a situation report, a sit rep, something like that, because and we forgot to mention it. The one thing that's not changed over this whole time is there is a directive in play that was issued first in 1948 and 1950 that says it's a JNAP reporting recommended that there is a protocol in place that if you observe anything that is estimated to be a threat to the United States, you got to report it.
Hmm.
And nowadays it would go to NORAD and it would go to the National Military Command Center in Washington, D.C., which works for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So if something critical occurred within the military, it would get reported, but it's treated on a one-off basis. Is it, you know, we have UFOs over the ICBM base. Did they come back? No, they weren't. Well, they came back a week later. Did anything get attacked? No. So it's treated just on okay, how do I respond to it? Do I deploy helicopters? Do I deploy troops? Do I do whatever?
Yeah, what do
Well,
you
if
do?
it's
I don't
not
know what.
continual, you don't respond. So that remained in play. That's in play in the 70s and the 80s and 90s. That stays in place. So we do have miscellaneous incidents that get reported. The only way we learn about them is researchers do Freedom of Information Acts. They go through NORAD data. Uh, but there's no more centralized reporting. Privately, there are, organizations exist and so on and so forth. But the intelligence/security community is out of the picture, except for these situations. Okay. Um, and that brings us all the way into this decade, until the whole thing is re-triggered by a series of incidents with military aircraft that get enough political attention and to to restart the process, as it were.
Mhm.
And we're still not back to where we were with Blue Book because The last time I know ARO has said that they're going to, but even when they started out, they did not have the process in place to collect reports from all the military services
Mm.
or Homeland Security or the different, we have so many more agencies now, you
Sure.
know, and they have very small staff. I would say, and now last year it was, well, we're only actually looking at incidents that were over military bases,
Mm.
which you can sort of understand, right? I mean, if we can't handle these 600 drones over the military bases, do I need more? I've got my hands full already,
Yeah.
and I should cite the profile. The NORAD chief this morning was talking about over Langley, okay, outside of Washington D.C. He to quote, he's talking about there were a whole series of these drones over a period of time in 2024. We know that they were about 20 feet long, pretty good size. We know that they were flying over 100 miles per hour at 3 to 4,000 feet in altitude, and they were coming in a parade, one after the other, after another. Now, you've got to say, that's probably it's worrisome, but with that on their plate, you can see why they're pretty tightly focused.
Yeah.
They've got drone swarms over Navy groups operating off San Diego. That you can see why they've got enough on their plate not to ponder the most anomalous incidents that we might come up with.
Yeah.
Uh,
They're not just sitting around like kind of considering the metaphysical implications of these things. They
and
really
and
want
not a single one of those incidents, he pointed out, not a single one. NORAD itself has no direction. All it can do is identify. It hands it over to another group called NORCOM, North American Continental Defense Command, essentially, which has the operational responsibility to respond to it. But the way we're structured now is each and every military base has to defend itself.
that doesn't seem that
And
doesn't seem like a good
this is not a
system.
happy thing. He's not happy about it. Nobody is happy about it. But we have not had any continental wide air defense system in place since the end of the Cold War. That's one of the reasons 9/11 came about. We're just not set up with an air defense system since the end of the Cold War. Interceptor bases all over the place, anti-aircraft, it's just not there. Now we're learning the lessons from Ukraine and Russia of how dangerous that could be. But just consider how much money it would have to be invested to
The
set up
United States
point
is
defense
enormous.
over every military base,
Yeah.
much less civilian uh, power plants and that
Yes,
sort of
it
thing.
would be
So,
like to have if to have a system where it wasn't every military base for itself, you'd have to have like meta military bases that defended other military bases. And where does that end? So that's
and
very
are you going to start putting you know, air defense guns and barrage balloons? And I mean, it's strange that we're seeing the worst possible case of what could happen with attack drones overseas. And now before it was just, oh, we're worried about defending against, half a dozen hypersonic missiles. Okay, how about 5,000 drones? Uh, you
So are these
know,
drones anomalous in are their flight capabilities anomalous or do they seem like terrestrial technologies that some
these seem like generally speaking, these seem like real world drones. Not now, one of the worrisome things about them in some of the incidents, like I think this is over Phoenix, the police did launch helicopters, police helicopters, and the drones, they couldn't catch them. So even at its max speed, so we don't know how good some of them might be, not all, but so the characteristics that we are observing are not anomalous, but they don't need to be if they
yeah,
can
they're still
cruise over.
worrisome.
The most recent series of drone events is over the Norfolk Joint Base, Navy, Air Force, our biggest base on the eastern seaboard. And we didn't touch one of those suckers.
And
And so
is the
you
theory
have
that they're just trying to see how well they can penetrate our airspace, or that they're there to observe things. I
I'm
mean,
not,
you
there's
make
not
fun of
much
it.
that's being written on that. And I'm sure there are defense people that are writing papers and, doing analysis, because this is a very tactical thing.
Yeah.
This would be their day job. Absolutely. As far as the NORAD fellow, their position at the moment is especially the 1Z, 2Z things are private. They're people that are playing games for whatever reason. Who knows why they're doing it? But certainly that stream of drones over Langley seems improbable to be private. The stream of drones off the Navy attack group off San Diego clearly was not private. But I guess we're trying to bring this all forward in time, and the strange thing is that we're back in 1952 again, and these things are. But even the UFOs that were sighted off Washington D.C. were not going at amazing speeds. Uh, they were just there, and they weren't. Maybe they were, but we could measure it. We
Yeah.
know that's a characteristic.
But we couldn't catch them, but they
But
weren't
we
like,
couldn't catch them up and down the East Coast. The UFOs that were being interceptors were sent. We're not able to engage with them any more than we don't appear to be able to engage with these drones, even with something like police helicopters. Now, is it disturbing that the NORAD, I don't know. We don't know is it really true that over this period of time, nobody tried to engage with those drones over Langley, that they truly didn't do it? Um,
never shot at them. You mean
uh,
that's the
Not
story,
just
right?
at least put aircraft up and intercept them and follow them back to their, you know, it kind of worries me. It's sort of like you can track them going over the base, but you couldn't put up an aircraft and follow them to where they went. Um, the same thing happened with the drones off San Diego, the swarms. They finally did seem to associate those with a couple of foreign flagged ships, which is very suspicious. But we don't know what they know, I guess. So but the real answer to your question is, with these incidents, we're not seeing truly anomalous behavior. That doesn't mean that some of them are not capable of it, but we're not challenging them. At least back in the 60s, we were challenging them enough so that, okay, now they accelerate away from the jet. We know something's going on. Now we're not really even engaging at all. All we have figured out so far is it appears that our jamming, electronic jamming, doesn't have much effect,
Hmm.
because we now know from documents that were released that the Navy deployed portable jammers and, electromagnetic guns and so on and so forth that did not seem to have any effect. So,
So one one technology that seems like it might have some application here that I know exists, I don't know how it's being used yet, are these really high altitude balloons or planes that just take like a super high definition photograph like every 30 seconds or something of a really big area. And then
mhm.
you can, I think police departments use this sometimes. You can basically like see where a robbery happened, then just scroll back through the photos and see where the truck that did the robbery came from, and then just go arrest them, right? Why don't we use that? Or are we using technologies like that, or like satellite imaging? I guess
Or
satellites don't have like a,
nobody's talking about, are we not doing satellite coverage of our own bases? That's kind of interesting question. But remember the balloons that came over the US,
yeah,
supposedly Chinese? At this point in time, I think out of four UAPs that were reported, we've only seen video footage from one,
one of them. Yeah.
and two or three of them were brought down by the Canadians. We've not seen any remains. We've, you know, we don't know. So to answer your question, this is a big hole. I suspect that from a security standpoint, we know a lot more that's being shared that would tell us one way or the other. But no, we're not seeing that information.
But even in that situation, I agree that has to be the case. There has to be information that somebody has that they're not sharing with the public. But even in that situation, you're saying the structure of the logic of our system is such that the only question that's really being asked is it a threat? And if not, it's being pushed off to the side. So
Right.
what is the future of the UAP subject? Are we stuck in America, at least in this sort of system where we'll never be able to really study it directly as anything other than a threat? What would it take to change that? What would you have to like change the structure of our government? Because I imagine a dictator could just say, yeah, go study it just because it's interesting. But in a democracy that's funded in the way that we are, threat seems like the prime concern.
You would almost have to find a foundation. Now we know Avi Loeb has been able to raise a huge amount of money to study a particular, subject. It almost has to be, it has to be foundational. There have to be NS National Science Foundation grants, Carnegie, whatever, Rockefeller. There've got to be a major pot of money that is made available and pointed towards the academic community to fund people that are actually interested in this. And we know there are people that would do this kind of research if it were part of their day job. So I guess what we established is we know it's not part of the day job of the intelligence security community. We have to make it part of the day job for the academic community. I think that's the only thing that would change it. And that's going to be a lot of money. It's got to be on parity with medical research. It's got to be on parity with climate research.
Like
It's
hundreds
got
of
to
millions
be,
or billions of dollars then.
yeah, yep.
I think that as an academic or former academic, I'm not teaching right now, but I can say that part of the logic of just how academics think is that, okay, if there were, say, a 3-year fellowship for me to go work on UAP, that would be really attractive to me. But I would also want to know what happens at the end of that 3 years. Like,
Yeah.
do I just, maybe I'll have a really good time, but will I get done and then their funding runs out and then I have to go back to the sort of normal academic job market and justify why I wasted 3 years in their view studying UAP.
Yeah.
So it's like, you don't just need funding for the moment, you need to create a
Well,
kind of self-sustaining ecosystem of this research so
yeah.
that people can say, oh, it's just going to be my career and I'm not going to have to worry about like 10 years down the
What
road.
is the career? I mean, you would also think that there certainly could be career paths in in physics. There could be career paths certainly in aerodynamics. I mean, there are some studies, areas of study that there are career paths, if material science, or one of the obvious ones is multispectral collection devices.
Mm-hmm.
What do I advancing our ability to collect frequencies? Somebody, I need a career program, a 20-year program for somebody to build me a tabletop gravity wave detector. Okay, that would be pretty cool. But that might be the most obvious one that would be broad spectrum. If you could posit there's physics going on here and say, I could make a whole career out of developing the equipment and measurements and devices needed to determine this, certainly within astronomy and astrophysics. Got to be within astrophysics. I mean, if we can look at black holes, if we, you know, so it seems to me there are some disciplines that natively could have a career path. What you've got to do is make them real. It's sort of like, you know, if I go into geology, I pretty well know where my career path is.
Yeah.
Where's the career path? As you're saying, if I go into, you know, advanced physics instrumentation, it probably is a career path. But as you're right, you'd have to have a whole series of, it's not just one grant that's going to be over and done, because I know I've heard enough from academics kind of like, oh, I've got a grant now, and the first priority I have is looking for the next grant.
Yeah, it's an
Right?
awful life to know that there's like a
Yeah.
clock ticking all the time and that you'll be homeless if you don't
Yeah.
come up with another grant. I
Well,
mean,
and that's why the foundations, I think, would be key. You'd almost need a foundation commitment that every year we're going to have this many grants funded at this level in this area of interest, uh, to show that kind of a commitment, to convince people, not just convince the the grad students and the masters and
No, yeah, you want
the
permanent
postdocs.
faculty.
You got to get something that looks real enough to the postdocs so that they're going to build their career around it.
And it seems like it's in all of the scenarios that we imagine, though, studying these things is still kind of enslaved to the logic of the economic market. Like you have to justify it by saying that there's some payoff in the end that doesn't have to do with just answering an interesting question.
Yeah.
That to me makes UA
What?
the study of UAP seem like a humanities course because
eh,
that's like what we
Well,
do in the humanities. We don't guarantee we're gonna like come up with a better bullet or something. We just think this stuff's interesting.
I'll give you an off the wall one on that one. Let's talk about climate. Let's what I
Mhm.
will give you one thing for everything we're seeing about the true UAPs implies that they have an element of energy that they have access to, whether it is fusion, particle annihilation, vacuum energy, that we don't, we have some physics to go to conceptualize it. We don't have any technology. And I will tell you, look at the last 40 years and where is the least advance been? Not that I don't love wind energy, but wind energy is not a technological advance.
Sure.
Solar energy, to some extent, is not a technological
We've had
advance.
we've had windmills for a really long time, so
We're not making any advance at all on real, solid, serious, next level energy. To me, if you're going to deal with climate, if you're going to deal with infrastructure, if you will, how critical is look at what Ukraine is going through now. If you really want to address the crisis, addressing energy generation is the key. You've got to have breakthroughs, which we have not had any of. Uh, low low energy fusion fission reactions, all of that stuff. It's hanging around, and there have been papers and that sort of stuff. But I think to me that's if you really want to get at the core of the UAPs, it's clear that they have some access to highly portable energy sources that's way beyond us because all of their other technology would come out of that.
mm.
What I could do with that energy, could I create space warps? If I had vacuum energy, yeah, and I knew how to. But so I guess to me, in brainstorming about fields of study within academics, how much money is actually being put into energy development? And I think within engineering and physics, I'm going to have to bet this is where there's an institutional. What's going on now is money being made to make things better that we already have, more efficient, lower overhead, whatever, make solar more efficient, make wind more efficient. Um, and that's where we seem to be stuck. So just kind of raw brainstorming, if you
Yeah.
really wanted to look at a foundational change that would address both UAPs and, be long-term career and society self-sustaining, it would be in energy.
Yeah, but energy doesn't, I mean, the search for free energy is actually like not an economically promising search because the goal of the capitalist economy is to keep money circulating, not
But
to
it
just
doesn't have to
find
be
free
free. It
stuff.
could
Or,
just be
yeah, sure.
controlled. I guess that it doesn't have to be. I know it's called free energy,
Yeah.
but let's again be off the wall. If I could get vacuum energy and literally an unstoppable energy tap at this point in time, it can't be free. I mean, I could destroy a planet with that level of energy.
Yeah.
So it's going to have to be controlled and structured. So I think free energy has been kind of a misnomer.
Sure.
Uh,
But even
it,
super cheap energy is not great for the way our economy works. Like making
yeah,
everything cheaper is kind of like bad for an economy that needs money to kind of keep circulating. So I'm not sure who it incentive. I mean, the physicists want to make it. Like everybody who works in physicists would love to make that discovery, but companies are not like pining for free energy for the most, or very, very, very cheap energy for
but
the.
that's where I get back to the foundations. You were talking about the humanities. The humanities are the foundations that fund the humanities are not profit. They're not putting the money in for profit, right? Uh, there, there are lots of disciplines and grant programs that are not associated with, commercial
Viability.
revenue. That's kind of it. It would have to be the right foundation. It would have to be a foundation, a seeding foundation. But I mean, you brought it up. There are lots of grants that go to the social sciences that have nothing to do with, you know, an economic solution. So
Yeah.
it's kind of, you'd almost have to be asking one of the humanitarian foundations to fund physics research.
Yeah.
How hard is that?
Well, maybe slowly we're making the case. It seems like the thing I've learned the most is this whole narrative shows that there's like a pervasive logic that doesn't suppress in like a conspiratorial way, but suppresses by its own logic and concerns genuine study of these phenomena in the way that you and I want to, in favor of studying them just to
Yeah.
see if they're just to answer the question of whether they're a threat to security or not. And then once it's deemed that they're not, we just kind of put it off to the side. And we need a different, an organization that has a different logic to it and a different set of goals in order to seriously study these things. There you go.
Okay. We are having thunderstorms here,
Yeah.
so I could, but yeah, that last comment, I totally agree. It's from one point of view, it's a systems issue from the intelligence and security standpoint. From the academic thing, I see it as a institutional structural thing. It's in neither sense is it conspiratorial, but that's why I think of it overall as a systems problem. The
Yeah.
systems on either side, the two pillars that you described, are just not set up for this.
Yeah, you don't need a conspiracy when systems work with their own internal logic. I mean, people think that if something looks intelligent or looks like the product of intelligent choice, that it must be somebody running things at the top. But systems have their own logic and values that they continually replicate and enforce upon the world without anybody steering it at the top. And it seems like we've kind of this subject has gotten caught in a system that isn't designed to handle it. It's not designed to answer questions about what's out there. And
It's in between. Like we built the two pillars to do something, and each does it relatively effectively, and this is in between.
neither. We need a third pillar. Larry, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. We've gone 2 hours. Is there anything that you want to plug? I know that you've got several books on this. Tell us what books you've written about
I,
this subject.
I say in regard to the history that we were talking about, how the evolution of the evolution of the problem within the intelligence community. I did do a book. Hold it up. It's called Unidentified: The National Security Challenge, the National Security Problem of UFOs. And it does start during World War II, goes through the ghost rocket phenomena. And one of the things I do, it's kind of that I thought was kind of interesting, was I go through the history of how the intelligence community reacted, both internally and externally, to the civilian community. And then an end posed the problem of, could somebody actually have looked for a pattern in all of this? If the Robertson panel had, not ended up where it did, what if this had been handed off to a strategic intelligence group?
Mm.
How would they have handled it? And I actually go through how they would likely have handled it, reaching the conclusion that no, it's not the Russians.
Mhm.
No, it's not. Over 30 years, it's not the Russians. So we need another answer. But so yeah, I think most of the history, I would say, if you're really history, that kind of detail in the history, that's what I tried to capture in the book.
And Unidentified by Larry Hancock. We will have a link to that book for Amazon or wherever else you can buy it in the show notes. Larry, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it was a pleasure. I enjoyed talking with you.
Always love talking to you. The Anomalous Review is a project of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. It's hosted and produced by me, Michael Glosson, and edited by Kelly Michelle. Our theme song was written and performed by Telma Cosanti. Communication and PR work is by Preston Dykes. Our advisory team includes Jennifer Roach, Robert Powell, Richard Hoffman, Joshua Pearson, and Larry Hancock. To find out more about SCU, check out explorescu.org.